Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And as we discussed in Phil Craig's last appearance, although 1945 brought one conflict to a conclusion, it also began others and set wheels in motion that would influence the next few decades in that part of the world. From his new book, The Reckoning, links in the description below. As always, Phil takes a look at Indochina and the East Indies. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Phil. How are you today?
I am well, and since you last spoke to me, I have ascended into heaven. Can you see?
Yes, so that your hotel background there looks like you've got some weird halo behind you.
It is the weirdest hotel room I've ever been in, but it's great to be with you.
So we were just talking about Frank before going live. And as I said there in the top of the show, it ends things, but it begins things. And what happened in that part of the world over the next few years and decades, incredibly important. And as we always say, we separate the various wars: the First World War, the Second World War, Korea and Vietnam, but really there's always these links between them. So we'll bring up your slides. I'll kind of hand it over to you to take us through this. And,
yeah, well, I thought I'd start with just a little short reading, just to set the scene kind of politically. There were some really interesting comments on the Borneo show. Thank you to everybody who engaged with us on that. And a lot of you were raising the politics and being sort of surprised. I think I was a little surprised as I researched this, at some of the cynicism that emerges, certainly in British foreign policy and colonial policy in the last months of the war and in the months that follow. I should say again, as I said before, this is not an anti-war book. My wonderful book. It's not an anti-war book. It's full of amazing, colourful and positive stories, but it does dig for hard truths because I like my history, warts and all. Anyway, I'm writing now about the propaganda. We mentioned the Atlantic Charter, this very bold declaration of a future that we're all fighting for, of self-determination, of free peoples. But even within the British Army, there was a version of this. I'm going to quote myself, if I may. In a much discussed pamphlet from the Army Education Corps called The British Way and Purpose, millions of men and women in uniform were able to read that, quotes, "We now no longer regard the colonial empire as a possession, but more as a trust or responsibility. Imperialism, in the less reputable sense of that term, is dead. There is obviously no room for it in the British Commonwealth of equal nation. It will be superseded by a principle of trusteeship." Statements like this would have had Winston Churchill spluttering into his brandy for most of his life, but they were distributed far and wide by a branch of his own government. Britain was fighting on the side of freedom now, so its empire must evolve into something else. Fast forward. So in one sense, a large number of British troops came to believe they were in fact waging war to abolish the age of empires altogether, including their own. And then I say this chimes in with things that George Orwell was writing, and that amazing play that Priestley wrote, An Inspector Calls, which I was amazed was written in 1944. I thought it was in the 50s. That's all about a new Britain, a changing world. Let's get past the past. Anyway, final paragraph. But playwrights do not generally lead governments. As with the words of the Atlantic Charter, leaflets like The British Way and Purpose could only ever articulate a vision of a post-colonial world. Both parties in Churchill's coalition, with his sometimes grudging assent, were happy to talk about that vision and the goal of colonial partnerships too. But as someone in the Colonial Office said at the time, apocryphally, but no less tellingly, a partnership can also be defined as that between a horse and its rider. What was meant by all this talk was change within a family of nations still directed from London. All those pink territories on the map would be steered towards a better future, but with white hands firmly on the reins and the cash coming back to the white tills. Because Britain was not going to stop being a global power overnight, however many standing ovations Priestley might receive in the West End. And there were many bills to pay. So sorry for the long spiel, but that sets the scene, I think, politically for what we're now going to talk about.
Yeah.
So here it is, the Atlantic Charter. Yes, it's amazing and inspiring. And it's funny, when it was published in 41, I put this in the book too, lots and lots of Commonwealth leaders from countries that will soon be conquered by Japan, they all rush to London and say, yippee, are we going to set a date then? And Churchill meets lots of them one-on-one, and they all come away having felt that they've been slightly exposed to that famous Churchillian phrase, weasel words. He makes it clear that these are ambitions, and they're primarily intended for the lands conquered by Hitler. But, so there's a bit of backsliding even in 41, and there's lots of backsliding in 45, which is what we'll get into now.
Yeah.
So we What's the next slide? I can't remember.
Next one is Eisenhower.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's also, I mean, these are the words that were this ringing, extraordinary statement that Eisenhower issues on the day of D-Day. You know, why are we fighting? For the oppressed peoples of Europe, security for ourselves in a free world. The free men of the world, the whole world, are marching for victory. You know, that was the propaganda.
And arguably the first use of the words United Nations. I mean, there is definitely a public announcement of a future working together under certain accepted international ways of doing things.
The words of the Atlantic Charter form the basis of the United Nations Declaration. So this is important stuff. But there were bills to pay. And also Roosevelt dies. And also Churchill's basic belief in empire kind of comes back to the fore. And so does Charles de Gaulle. What's the next slide? Okay, so that we're now talking about Vietnam. I mean, this is just the most mind-boggling story. Let's go through it slowly. This is a photograph of the OSS training the Viet Minh. Now, the Viet Minh were a guerrilla army led by this nationalist and communist Ho Chi Minh, man who becomes very famous. He is very, very excited to have a partnership with the OSS because they are the eyes and ears of America. They're the forerunners of the CIA. And he receives lots of encouragement. There's a meeting there between a man called Archimedes Patty, great name, with one of Ho Chi Minh's top people. They actually help him draft the Declaration of Independence that he issues at the end of the war. So what happens is Japan has ruled Vietnam, Indochina, through Vichy France. It was a French colony.
Yeah.
The French people that were running it went with Vichy. So they're kind of allies of the Japanese. And that kind of works for a while. But of course, when France is liberated, the government in France now changes. The Japanese throw all these Vichy people into prison and take the place over themselves. Now, Ho Chi Minh has been fighting a guerrilla war with American help, considers himself an ally of the West, writes loads of amazingly kind of ingratiating, polite letters, quoting the Declaration of Independence to Washington, to London, to the newly formed United Nations, and really expects to be a friend of the West and that they will accept, as promised in the Atlantic Charter, that he can now run Vietnam. And this is the actual official Declaration of Independence. He issued it in Hanoi, which is he's very strong in the north. Look what he quotes at the very beginning. The very first words of the Declaration of Independence are quoted from the American founding fathers. That's not an accident. They were put there by Americans too, and they thought it was great. But nobody tells Ho Chi Minh that in London, de Gaulle and Churchill, actually fast forward a bit because there's quite a lot of this stuff. I don't expect people to read it all. But it's clear from this declaration that he's saying, we welcome the friendship of the Americans. We welcome the friendship of the British. We're not having the French back. We don't like them. They've exploited us. They've taken our money. They've thrown us into prison. They've killed us. We do not want to be French again. Is that okay, guys? That's kind of what this is all about. But de Gaulle and Churchill have other opinions. De Gaulle, like Churchill, is a emotional imperialist. He's seen France humiliated, conquered. He believes in the glory of France. And the glory of France to him means retaining its imperial possessions. Churchill, similarly emotionally attached to empire and also very conscious. There are lots of other British territories. We mentioned Borneo, Malaya is another one that he really wants to hang on to for the money. And actually, when he loses power to Clement Attlee, the Labour government has a very similar attitude. So they cook up a scheme. I think if Roosevelt had lived, he may have stopped this. Roosevelt was on the record. It's all over Alan Brooks' diaries. He hated de Gaulle. I mean, he certainly hated the idea that de Gaulle would put the French back into Indochina. He's always saying that they made a terrible mess of the place, amongst the worst colonists of all. But Truman takes a different view. He's much more malleable. Plus, I think he's also influenced by the kind of Cold War, looming Cold War. It's very easy for the British and the French to say, that guy Ho Chi Minh, I know he's your friend, but he's a bit of a communist, isn't he?
Yeah.
And so
is it fair, just to interrupt you for a second, is it fair to say that Truman, coming in as he did late, was not part of, if you like, earlier promises made? Because as we talked about in the Borneo show, various people across the world, OSS, SOE, had been promising things, frankly, they couldn't really deliver. The same thing happened in Yugoslavia, other places. But Truman hasn't been part of that promise. So he hasn't on a personal level, he hasn't promised anything.
Oh, no, this is
Churchill,
a time.
as you said, has definitely had conversations with people where he's, been colourful with the
To be
truth.
honest,
So Truman,
if I'd wanted a more downbeat title, I was thinking of calling it Broken Promises. And it's
right?
not. I
Yeah,
mean, Truman also absolutely weasels on the nuclear stuff.
yeah,
It's British technology and British scientists have played a very big part in the development of the atom bomb. And there's a deal done, it's called the Quebec Treaty, where the British will get access to all the info and Truman stops it.
yeah.
British scientists who had been working on documents the day before are basically locked out of their offices. So
Yeah.
everything is changing. But in this case, he is willing to look the other way while the French and the British send an army to Indochina to take it back and confront Ho Chi Minh. This guy you're seeing here, this is de Gaulle and Leclerc marching to liberate Paris. And then here is Leclerc, the same guy, inspecting units of the British Indian Army a few months later, set on a mission to unliberate, you might say, Vietnam. So it's pretty cynical stuff. And here's Leclerc's own writings make it clear that he is going there on a mission to secure the future of the white race in Asia.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder how those Indian soldiers about to be sent into battle would have thought about that.
Yeah.
Of course, India's still, they're negotiating independence now, but they're still an Indian army. And they're bloody good. They just won this huge victory in Burma. So we send a division or more to help with de Klerk. Here's Hanoi. This is just to show how popular Ho Chi Minh is in the north. This is him delivering the declaration. Huge acclaim. But what happens in the south, in Saigon, which is where the Brits are, and the French make their kind of first bridgehead. It gets complicated. So Douglas Gracie is a 20th Indian Division commander. When Gracie arrives in Vietnam, he can immediately see banners in the street that read, "Welcome British and Americans, but no room here for the French. French go home." Fearing anarchy and feeling outnumbered, Gracie quickly agreed to release and rearm, guess who? French Vichy prisoners. Okay, so they're now on our side. They'd served in the Vichy system, so we're now allying to them. But amid agitation from numerous factions, and it is very complicated, rioting breaks out, Viet Minh patrols and guerrillas start to clash with the French and the British and the Indians. And soon there's a war, and Gracie is appealing for reinforcements. Now, this is the killer paragraph. And it's here that the story becomes astonishing, because the reinforcements most readily available were Japanese prisoners of war, part of the army that had until recently occupied Vietnam, indeed terrorized Vietnam. Some of them had fought in other campaigns and were no doubt involved in the murder of Allied soldiers, prisoners, and civilians. And yet, despite all of this, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were given rifles and told to serve under British command. In every case, they did so willingly and enthusiastically. It's worth noting that numerous Japanese war crimes were being revealed at this exact moment as the emaciated survivors of prison camps and railway gangs came home and told their shocking stories. But none of that stopped the rearmament and deployment of what were officially called Japanese surrendered persons. Ho Chi Minh appealed to the United Nations, saying that the French had no moral right to govern its old colony, certainly not like this, but nobody of consequence ever replied. So as a nasty war breaks out, there's Gracie. This is some French troops, and they're being saluted by Japanese prisoners of war. So, I mean, these pictures, most people just don't even know this stuff.
And it comes so quickly after things being so different. I mean, as a Francophile, de Gaulle and Leclerc were riding a crest of popularity in 45 that, I mean, it was going to change for de Gaulle in the 50s with, as Algeria and everything else. But right now that they've secured a place in the big four in all the conferences. They're there. They've got a quarter of Berlin in that sense. And Leclerc, bizarre, his division in Normandy had Spanish troops. It had African-American, French troops. And now he's kind of marching against that. Things change really quickly.
We just have to. There's lots about this in the book. You have to put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah,
this was an age of empires. This is how people thought, and even the British Labour government thinks like this. It just seems like the natural order of things. Yes, we'll talk about progress and liberal principles, and maybe in the next decade we'll have a conference and work with you. Meanwhile, of course, we'll take all the cash and we'll shoot anybody who tries to throw us out. So here, these are all Japanese surrendered persons, some of them working on an airfield, some of them carrying rifles, as you can see. serving under British and French command, mostly British, but serving alongside the French in this nasty war where there are, ambushes, massacres, prisoners are not often taken. It's very nasty, and it completely shatters Ho Chi Minh's faith in the West, obviously.
Yeah.
He feels utterly double-crossed. And as we said last week when we spoke, it kind of sets up the region, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, for another horrible war, Franco-Vietnamese. And then the Americans come and the Australians come, and this carpet bombing and Agent Orange, and who knows, 3 million dead. And at the end of it, Ho Chi Minh is running the country, which is what could have happened in 45 and was sort of promised, kind of, by the Americans.
And, we talk often about how badly the Allies and the Western Allies and the victors handled peace in 1918, 1919 after the First World War. And we kind of collectively pat ourselves on the back and said, well, we didn't quite make that mistake in 45, but yet we kind of, I'm not saying that mistakes were made, but courses were charted that may not have been the right course with hindsight. I mean, as you said, it was very difficult to predict the future, and the situation was complicated, and there were alliances and agreements and deals. And
a lot of people in London, a lot of MPs are very unhappy about this, just as they were in Greece when Churchill sent troops to kind of kick the communists out. There's a nasty little civil war at Athens at the end of 44. And we find ourselves allying with effectively former Nazis.
Yeah.
Again, the justification is these are Stalin's men, so we must keep them
exactly. Out. And there's a book that I used that because it had the photo that we wanted there of the situation going on there. That's
Gracie. That's Gracie.
Gracie there.
More Japanese soldiers under his command. Amazing, isn't it?
And the fact, as you said there, this is, as I said on the top of the show, it's ending a conflict of 5 or 6 years, but beginning one that's going to go on for best part of 3 decades.
I think it was morally wrong, but it was strategically very foolish. The OSS, and I quote them in the book, wrote lots and lots of messages saying it's foolish to confront Ho Chi Minh. He's genuinely very, very popular in the north and also in bits of the south. He does seem to us, and it's our job to work out what's happening, to be the most obvious partner, and the people's choice, whether we care he's a communist or not. He wants to work with us. He's always quoting the Declaration of Independence. Come on, guys, let's be pragmatic. And those memos are discovered at the height of the Vietnam War in some bloody filing cabinet in Washington, and they're on the front page of the Washington Post. People are amazed that before we get into this war that's tearing America apart and blowing Vietnam to bits, there was this. They got so close to kind of just doing the obvious thing.
Yeah, we had a question about where one of the other prominent Vietnamese leaders was at that time. Let me get the question back up again. It's about, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Giap.
I think he was in one of those photos talking to Archimedes Petty, I think.
Yeah, that's right. You said, yeah. But I can't find the questions now. But
he's the great guerrilla general, isn't he?
Yeah.
Of Ho. Yeah, he's a military guru.
I can't find the question now because it reminds me of that situation prior to Operation Torch when the Americans are trying to decide which of the various French horses to back in the future race that eventually became de Gaulle's race. But he was by no means the most likely candidate for a period there. They can say, and of course, we as students of history, when we hear the word Ho Chi Minh, like when we hear Mao Zedong or whatever it was, we have connotations. But there were times when the various peoples, it wasn't sure which horse was going to be the victorious horse, which way the wind was blowing. Gandhi is another figure that at this time that we know which way it went, but at the time the labels these people are being given by different types of press, anything from freedom fighter to terrorist to, as you say there, the fact that Ho Chi Minh is quoting the Declaration of Independence in the USA in his own Declaration of Independence is that at that point, he seems like, as you said, an ally, a like-minded individual.
I mean, where do you start with this? There's a lot about India in my book as well. And I find it astonishing that Bose is the hero of independence now.
Yeah.
And he is acclaimed by the Prime Minister and they name airports after him in schools. And actually, he was in with the Nazis, in with the Japanese. I think the real heroes of Indian independence were the Indians of the Indian Army, not Bose. But it's easy to look back and go for the simple choice. And that's what people tend to do,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Anyway, these are more scenes from the fighting. I think these are French troops in the bottom picture, and that's a Viet Minh guerrilla with some scary-looking bazooka thing, or a mine on a stick. Don't know what that is. And it's full-scale war. You know, it looks a bit like the Vietnam War proper from the 60s.
Yeah.
But it's happening in 45 at the beginning of 46. The British kind of get out. Oh, that's the next story. The British kind of get out.
Right.
They win. Gracie wins. And he's very grateful to get out and leave the French in charge. I think privately he's a bit anxious about what's going to happen.
But we had a good question from Gary about how much of this made the press. You know, were any of these images or information about the use of Japanese POWs made open to the public? I mean, for a start, I'll answer, then I'll let you answer it. Everybody has got massive war fatigue by 1945. People want to hear about housing and health service. I'm talking about Britain specifically. In America, they want to hear about boom and people coming home and GI brides and new life and children. Everyone's like, can we stop with the fucking war news? But I'm guessing it wasn't so much buried as just people weren't interested.
There was concern about embracing colonial agendas. There was criticism in the left-wing press, but it was quite muted. There's a Labour government now. They seem to be quite happy with it. So who are we to question them? And then, as you say, everybody's focused on other things. The Japanese surrendered people, the JSPs, it's not a secret. I haven't found a secret document. The military historians know that it happened. It's just never received much prominence, except, of course, in the countries where they were used. So you talk to a Vietnamese person, and we're going to go in a minute, and an Indonesian person, they know all about it for sure. It's just we choose not to remember some things that don't sit easily with the national mythology. And for Britain, of course, that's first of all, we were the underdog, and then secondly, we're the liberator. And there's truth in both those statements.
Yeah.
But it's also true to say, from the perspective of colonized people, we were never the underdog, never had been. And we were doing some liberating, but some oppressing as well. So,
I mean, that was the discussion in the Borneo show, wasn't it? And again, this idea of we're prepared to ally ourselves with certain people when there's an immediate need for them, and make tentative promises that we weren't necessarily going to stick to. And then the situation has now changed. A war has been resolved, and it's okay. So now some of these things that we offered, promised, discussed, we want to discuss something different now. Everybody's got a different agenda to bring to the table, because the war coming to an end, in a sense, was the worst thing to happen for the reason because it just, everything that had been on temporary hold now comes back to the forefront.
Yep, very true.
Yeah,
very true.
So that's what escalates in Vietnam and and 45. So those, again, folks, those who want to read about this and kind of foreshadow or understand what foreshadowed the next few decades, again, get the book there. But now we're moving to the East Indies. So
this is actually a bigger battle. Many more people die than in Vietnam. There's a battle in Surabaya, which nobody really knows. 30,000 people are killed. The city is absolutely smashed to pieces. There's naval gunfire, RAF bombing raids. It's the biggest land battle fought by a British army since the end of the Second World War. And it's actually in October, November of 45. It's like bigger than the Falklands by some distance. It's a huge operation. Again, mostly British Indian Army in alliance with the Dutch. The Dutch want their empire back too. They've recently been liberated. They're also broke. And there's a lot of anger. And this is why, I want to be fair. There's a lot of anger towards the nationalists, because when the Japanese came in 42, a lot of Dutch people, prisoners of war and civilians, were slaughtered. They also slaughtered Western, like missionaries, teachers, British, Australian, American. There was an explosion of sort of anti-colonial rage, which led to a lot of atrocities. That made the Dutch very, very angry. And that's understandable. And that's partly behind why they're so desperate to get the colony back. But the really big reason is the Royal Dutch Shell Company, which operates like all the big oil concessions. Britain's a very big investor in that too. Lots of lobbying, lots of pressure. Attlee's government agrees that it's a good idea to go and help them get back into power. It's very difficult, this one. There is something in the charge that they're fighting communist guerrillas. It's a less clear cut than Ho Chi Minh, But as I say in the book, was any of this a good enough reason to send in British troops with the order to wind back the imperial clock when the Dutch were clearly not wanted back by an overwhelming majority of the people of the country? British medic Harry Walker, who took part in the Battle of Surabaya, didn't think so, and he was appalled at the level of civilian death. It's hard to see this at the end of a war, our method of pacifying a country. We just blow this down to bits and bomb and shell and kill inhabitants. We had 200-odd Javanese civilians in the hospital with legs blown off, arms missing, shot in the guts, head, kids, women. We're killing these people. They'll hate us forever. And it's the end. It's the Dutch who will take over the country, and our name will stink out here for the rest of recorded time. Horrible details. And actually, a lot of Americans are amazed at how forgiving the Vietnamese are when they go on holiday. And I think it's the same is true in Indonesia. One of its national holidays actually is celebrating this battle. Celebrating is the wrong word, commemorating it. But as you now know, I think we're in a trade deal. We have a trade deal with Indonesia. We are Indonesian kids, along with Malaysian kids and lots of kids from that region coming to London. They want to be friends. That's a lovely thing. But for a while, we were really hated in this country because of this. And actually, unlike Vietnam, it doesn't even work particularly well. Here's some more details of the fighting. This is the nationalist militia at the bottom right. And that's a battle scene. I think that might be a Japanese soldier serving in the British Army there. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't even work because after 2 years, the penny drops. The locals are never going to accept the Dutch, and they have to negotiate their departure. But, at least 50,000 people die before that realization dawns. And it's just it's really it's a story of arrogance, I suppose, overconfidence. And just failing to understand that when Japan sweeps through that region, whatever you think of the Japanese, and they do some horrible things, everything will now change. The genie is out of the bottle. People are not going to welcome the white man back ever again, pretty much anywhere. And the Dutch, having been occupied themselves and suffered terribly, you might think they'd understand that, but they don't. But the biggest mistake, I think, is the British, and it's Attlee's government.
Is there a fair point to say that the education of people, which was very, very important to everybody in World War II, and you mentioned all the education pamphlets that the British Army got, but they're by no means the only people. When the OSS or the SOE spoke to people in Myanmar or Borneo, it was always coming with manuals, instructions, and here's how you can do this, and engineering. And so this idea of everybody getting an idea, and that is certainly about the idea of self-governing and independence and fighting for freedom. You've sown the seeds, if you're the Dutch, the French, the British, really of your own downfall. You're giving people the people you're wanting to work for you. They had the ideas anyway, but you're reinforcing the ideas.
Well, that's true. And I think a lot of the leading nationalists, of course, in all of these countries were actually educated in Britain. So yeah. I think somewhere else in the book, I said Britain's great universities probably did more to spread, decolonialization theory than anything out of Moscow. And I think it's just not realizing that the times have changed. There's a great description. The actor Dirk Bogarde, famous movie star. Well, he's Dutch. It's probably obvious. He's there serving with the British. He writes this very beautiful description. It's like a movie script of driving through, I think it's Surabaya. I think it might be, maybe it's Jakarta. I'm not sure. Driving through a town where there's been a gunfight. The streets like this in this photograph. Mm. And it's late at night, and he hears this sort of sound of music and clinking glasses. And he comes upon this, I don't know whether it's the embassy building or a high commission building. And on the beautifully maintained lawn are all these British officers in their dress uniforms, drinking, and he says, with their recently acquired local girlfriends, and shooting their revolvers into the sky in celebration. And it's just like a scene from a Carry On film, I think, or certainly a scene from a different century. We send our young men to besport themselves, have a bit of a fun, and kick the natives around, sleep with people, drink too much. But that world is dying, and the penny hasn't quite dropped yet. Actually, it does drop in Indonesia by, I don't know, 50, 51. I forget the exact date.
Mm. Yeah, well, we'll do a few more photos, and there's a few questions for you, Phil. So,
these are Indian Army troops fighting in Indonesia. Doesn't that look like it's the Vietnam War? That could be Tet Offensive, except it's Bren guns and British Army helmets, British Indian soldiers. This is a nationalist leader, fire and brimstone. We must drive the foreigners out. But as Patty said, sorry, that's Vietnam. But as the local versions of Patty said, it was obvious to people that were looking at the country and trying to assess who was up and who was down, that these nationalist leaders, whatever they had done in 42, were actually popular and could hold the country together, which they proved in the end to do.
Well, we've got some comments and questions I'd like to go. So Rob Crane is saying, part of me wonders whether the Second World War made any difference to this. Even recent history suggests if you remove a colonial dictatorial regime that has sided with a particular group, it can prompt mayhem. So it's a good point that these things had been in place. These ideas had been in place before. Did the Second World War just speed things up, I suppose, is what it did. It didn't change, it didn't alter things, but sped things up. Is that a fair comment?
It certainly sped things up in India. No question. And some would say they rushed it in the end with terrible consequences. Some would say partition was always going to happen. It was always going to be horrible. But it certainly rushed it there. I think when you go to war on the basis of self-determination and fighting tyrants, people hear what you're saying. They don't hear the weasel words that Churchill might say in some club over a cigar. They hear that message. And then when you don't deliver, you're open to the charge of hypocrisy. But Rob's point about removing a dictator, I assume you're referring to places like Iraq, can suddenly cause enormous explosions of foreign intervention from others or communal war between groups that the dictator had held down. That sort of happens in Vietnam. But I think, to be honest, Ho Chi Minh was way more popular than most guerrilla leaders in Iraq ever were. He had a very big constituency. Not everybody wanted him. As we know, in the South, some of them didn't and were prepared to fight. But as soon as the Americans pulled their support, it was clear what was going to happen in the 70s. And that probably would have happened in the 40s too. Indonesia, I don't think it's a fair comparison because there's only really one big guerrilla army. I know later there's factions and the Australians get involved. That's all very complicated. But in 45, there's really only one big force of nationalists. And it's not Indonesian fighting Indonesian, unfortunately. Fortunately for them, it's Indonesians fighting Indians, Japanese, Dutch, and us.
Thank you. So Michael Dunn is saying, you've kind of half answered this, but why did Britain and the United States back off from supporting the Dutch return to Indonesia, but went the other way with the French in Indochina, returned, kind of aided, and really aided in 1949? Because that is an interesting thing. The British, it's not like the British government or the Dutch or the French have a standard policy they apply to all the parts. It's very much they adapt it to the area. But have you got an answer to that?
Well, I do, actually. One is NATO, the desire to tie France into a Western security alliance, where before it's called NATO and after it's called NATO. France is seen as a great power. It's developing a nuclear weapons as well. It's got a seat at the table at the UN. But they win at first, so it's kind of easier to say, well, we've got to go with the flow now. We've let them get back in. They seem to be doing a reasonable job. Well, obviously, during the 50s, it begins to unravel, and then the Americans have to help them big time. With the Dutch, they never quite conquer Indonesia. It's a big place.
Oh, your hotel Wi-Fi is playing up a little bit. We lost you there. Hopefully, Phil will be back. Oh. In the meantime, folks, please consider becoming a patron and click like and subscribe. Hopefully, Phil will come back in for your last few questions. But hotel Wi-Fi is one of those things. Hopefully he'll be back. If not, we are back tomorrow, by the way. We're talking with Stuart Burbridge about night fighters.
Sorry, I lost you, Paul.
We did, but I was filling in without you. We just lost you for a couple of minutes, but I think we'd got most of your answers to that.
Well, I was just saying the Dutch were as important as the French, basically, to the Americans, and also they didn't really win. So it was easy, and then there was press pressure. It becomes a progressive cause. Anti-colonialism becomes a ever more big cause in left of centre and progressive circles in universities, newspapers. So it's a good sop to that lobby to say, well, you can let the Dutch go, but the French, they're important. We've got to keep them back. Got to back them up for a while, which of course America does.
Brilliant. And there's two comments from Gregory Fontenot, Colonel Fontenot, who's been on the channel several times. The US military loves talking about transition, but the military doesn't manage transition. Governments do, and they don't do well. And then his next comment, the USA is pretty good at screwing up transition. See OIF, OEF, and ODS for just 3 examples. We need our politicians to read this man's book. So high praise from Colonel Fontenot.
Thank you, Gregory. Well, actually, that's what you said in your first comment there, Gregory. It's pretty much what Gracie says when he leaves.
Yeah.
He says, we've done our best, our gallant 20th Indian Division. Now it's up to the politicians just how much confidence in them.
Yeah. And then Sir Capo is saying the premise of Western colonialism was that powerful centralized Western powers were going to provide security in return for raw materials. World War II overturned that. I mean, that's a very good point. The security that, I mean, it goes back to kind of the trading and the ships and the India Company and things like, going back centuries, is that the idea had been the British, the French, the Dutch would give stability and protection.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, it's a very good point, this, because that's why 42 is so important. Because there is this sense globally that, the Western powers run things better. We're more powerful, we're more organized, we're more educated. These people need us. That's the belief. And sometimes that's the belief of colonized people too. So imagine the shock, and in many cases, the thrill of seeing another Asian power, the Japanese, just sweep through country after country in a matter of weeks. And all these massive fortresses like Singapore just fall. These battleships get sunk. Western armies just run away. American too, in the Philippines, and they don't run away, but they're beaten. And I think the thrill of that it means that they're never going to look at the West in the same way. They're never going to be as scared of us, but also they're never going to rely on us for security. They think, well, we can do it ourselves. It was a paper tiger all along. So that's profoundly, I think, important psychologically. And I think, again, some of the Western leaders at the time expect to be welcomed back with open arms, because maybe the local elites they talk to are the ones saying, come back, but they were probably the ones that got invited to the golf club, the bridge club. But a lot of ordinary people rather like the idea of trying to create a new nation for themselves, which includes the oil fields and the money resulting from that.
Well, my last question is going to be, or probably my last question is, are there any people that begin their careers in 1945 who you think are the ones that are the significant players, maybe 10, 15 years there? They're kind of these, because some of the names you've been citing today, going back to de Gaulle and Leclerc and Ho Chi Minh, they're big names, but there were people further down but became important later on. Anyone particularly that springs to mind?
Well, I don't go into him very much in this book. Mao Zedong is rather significant. I mean, he's known of before, but 45 is the beginning of his ascendance, for sure. I don't know really in terms of the West. I think a whole class of people come out of the British Army. And if you read George MacDonald Fraser's book about Burma, you meet lots of those who are very determined to try and create a different kind of Britain. So I think the clock is ticking on empire, even whatever trouble there is in the colonies or revolutionary movements. But it's very complex, and there's a lot of lingering affection, even amongst people who will later rebel. There's a great character in the book who fights in Burma from modern day Kenya, and he fights under Slim, and he writes about how wonderful it was to be part of a multiracial army. There's no prejudice, and they all feel they're in a good cause. But he also says, we all believe in my regiment that we're fighting this in order to learn skills to take freedom. And in about 10 years from that moment, he's fighting in the Mau Mau against the British. So people do feel affection and loyalty, and those forces which historians often underestimate. And I think that's partly why so many of the Indian Army stayed loyal rather than go with bows. But there was also a growing sense that this really should be it. One and done. The last time we'll fight for you guys. Now you need to let us go. And how that was managed, well, that was a story for the 50s and 60s. Sometimes subtly and well, more often than not, slowly and badly. Yeah,
good point. John Sowerby mentioned Westmoreland, who obviously is a big figure later on in the war, but because he was in the US Army. Was he in this theater in 44?
I have no idea. I have no idea.
No, I can't remember.
I don't think Americans fight in Vietnam. Maybe certainly a couple of OSS guys are killed. I don't think they're fighting there yet. And I've no idea whether they're involved in Dutch East Indies? I think probably not.
Okay, and then we talked about the book and your hopes for the book, and it's not a negative book, although it obviously addresses empire, it addresses some of the perhaps decisions made by governments that we can look back at now and say, well, maybe not the right one. But did your in the process of researching and writing the book, did your opinions about our nations change radically? Did you come out kind of the same kind of person you were at the beginning, or was it revolution during the book?
Well, I think I did appreciate more the story of Britain in the Second World War through foreign eyes, which is what I set out to try and in the final book, because the first two are a bit more about, one's Battle of Britain and one's the desert. This is a bigger canvas. And I think the opinions of the people, both Britain's allies and subjects, are really instructive and interesting. And you see your own country through very different eyes. And some of that is affectionate. And there's lots of loyalty and lots of courage. And the British Indian Army, oh my God, I mean, if there's a hero of this book, it's General Thimaya, who is the great antidote to POWs. He doesn't trust POWs. He doesn't trust the Japanese. He wants independence, but he's going to fight with the British because he loves the Indian Army. And he helps turn it into this most incredible machine. I don't think I'd appreciated that when I started, just how good they were. I mean, one of the greatest armies ever to take to the field, as Rob Lyman has said many times, no doubt on it, But I think the cynicism on display in places like Borneo and Vietnam was a bit of a shock to me. I still like to think, I used to be in the RAF, and I do believe the power of Britain's empire was so important in stopping something way worse in 1940. But, that power was only powerful because historically it had been quite cynical and brutal too. And you can't really separate the two things. And I guess that's the message of the book, really. To understand it all, you need to see it all in whole, warts and all. But it's
that's a very good point. And it's I hate these discussions where everything is incredibly critical of the empire, but I also hate the ones where people are overly we gave bridges around the world. It's like Churchill. Churchill is fascinating because he isn't perfect, because there are aspects you go, well done, Sir Winston, and other things you go, oh, what was he thinking? And I think this is the dilemma of history, is that it isn't always black and white. There is always these levels of nuance, and we can look at the empires of Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and indeed the Americans' aspirations around the world and the Philippines. And there are things that we can go, well, that was really good. And there are things that we can go, well, no.
Well, I talk about in Finest Hour, actually, also in this book, too, a little bit. When the American journalists come to London in 1940 to write about the Blitz, most of them are kind of lefty progressive newspapers, Democrats, New Dealers. They historically have not thought much of Britain. They've seen it as a problem in the world, trade policies, which they blame for the Great Depression, partly true, partly not true. And they blame it for holding down places like India. So they don't necessarily come to Britain wanting to identify with the Brits. Of course they do. They change dramatically, more than Ed Murrow and all those famous broadcasts, because they're there. This German air offensive, France has fallen, the world's in shock. Oh my God, the British are so brave, hanging on, taking this punishment, standing up for civilization. So from being this kind of oppressive superpower to this plucky defender of freedom, that's the big shape. But the point is, it was always both. And never more so than in the Second World War. So that's kind of important to understand, I think.
Yeah. Well, we will end things there, Phil. So
thank you so much.
As always, good luck with the book. People are going to go out there and buy it. Some people bought the first one. We welcome your comments afterwards.
Next time you want to do the Indian Army, let's do that.
Let's do
much
the Indian
more
Army.
Positive. Be very positive.
Let's do the Indian Army. And your halo there makes you just look even more wise and learned. So,
bless you, my son.
See you again tomorrow, everybody. This is Paul Woodard from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.